Hey guys, this is Josh JCL Felto for The Writer's Lens, and today again I am bringing on a special guest in the form of one Darrick Dean, a fantasy author and a friend of mine. Say hello, Darrick.
Hi, everyone.
Hey man.
It's, hey,
Everyone on the internet knows again that I am not a liar, and there is someone else on this episode today. So, and if you're viewing with video, you can see Darrick as well, I'm sure. So, anyway, let's get to it. Darrick is, like myself, a self-published author, and Darrick and I connected about a year ago now, so this is September of 2017. We connected, almost about a year ago at a book signing event in Pennsylvania, and we exchanged some information. We got each other's books. We started checking out each other's stuff, seemed to like each other's stuff, so I decided to keep in touch with Darrick, and now here we are. So that's pretty much how I know Darrick. And I brought him on here to ask him some questions about his book, obviously, which I do have here, right here as well, Among the Shadows. There it is. And I want to talk about that and also just his experience as a writer. So without any further ado, Darrick, you write fantasy. This is a fantasy book that I do know of, but what got you started into just writing in general anyway? Like, what got you into wanting to be a writer?
it's kind of odd because my background is more in science and physics and math. I've always had that interest, but at the same time, I always had an interest. I've always read a lot. I've always had ideas for writing for books, and I was big into science fiction most of my life. And even when I was younger, I tried writing things and little stories. So I always wanted to write something, and it wasn't until a lot older, really relatively recently, that I finally figured out, what I wanted to write. I knew I had some ideas and knew kind of where I wanted to go, but once I discovered the fantasy genre it's probably been about 16 years now ago, which growing up I never really read a lot of fantasy. It was always science fiction, but right before the Lord of the Rings movies came out, I finally read those books, and I always wanted to. Finally read them, and instantly I said, okay, this is the kind of fiction I want to write. Not exactly, but in the fantasy genre, and to really combine that with my interest in history and some other things, and try to bring something, kind of a new spin on it a little bit. So it's been just long, over my whole life, just different things coming together. Just it was always something there, and I knew I always wanted to do that, and finally got to the point where I was ready to, knew what I wanted to do, and it's all started to come together.
That's awesome. What were some favorite science fiction books of yours when you were growing up?
Well, one of my favorite authors, and still is Ray Bradbury, who passed away a few years ago. But he wrote a lot of great short stories, some longer books like Fahrenheit 451 and Martian Chronicles, and a lot of things along that lines. And he did some that were more on the fantasy end too, but mostly hard science fiction. And there was a couple other authors in there, but I like a lot of the classics like Orwell and Huxley. A lot of those, kind of subversive science fiction.
Yeah, all those guys were like dark prophets. They were the guys that were always like, "This is the future, and it's going to be terrible."
always, always liked that kind of science fiction. And later, I would discover, actually, a couple years ago, Edgar Rice Burroughs, who's one of my favorite authors.
Excellent.
The father of high adventure sci-fi, really inspired just about everyone else. And even if you read his books now, it's hard to believe they're over a century old. They don't read like they were. He was the John Carter Mars books, and he did a series Venus. Of course, he's known for Tarzan, which I never got into. I always liked his sci-fi better.
I'm with you on that one, brother. I'm with you on that one. I like his sci-fi stuff a lot better. So.
Yeah, it's really over the top and exciting and fun, and just really good, really modern feel to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's another one that I've really liked.
Did you ever read Frank Herbert at all, like the Dune series? Did you ever get into
I
that?
I read the first one. I couldn't really get into it, and it's been a long time ago. It's one of those ones where maybe someday I'll go back and try again now that I'm older.
Yeah.
But yeah, I didn't. I remember, I read the first, but for some reason I just didn't get into the series.
Yeah, the first one you kind of have to dig through, but I felt like that was the book that did it for me as a science fiction enthusiast, was Frank Herbert's original Dune book. And the books that subsequently come after that are a little bit, I don't want to say they're different, but they don't grab you as much, I thought, as the first one. And the first one I read, I think, when I was about 13. And that's what really made me go, okay, I like science fiction. And he was a guy who was right before Star Wars. Yeah, the timeline, I think he was in the 60s. So just like in the same vein as like an Edgar Rice Burroughs, who was talking about jumping around on Mars, on the surface of Mars in the early 1900s, which is insane when you think about it.
Yeah.
You know how far ahead of his time this guy was. It's really something. It's really something. So yeah, I was just curious if you delved into there as well as a fellow science fiction guy.
Yeah, I sampled a lot of different guys. Ben Bova did some good Mars stories.
Mm-hmm.
Kim Stanley Robinson did a great Mars trilogy. It's kind of, your book was on Mars, and that was always an interest of mine as far as nonfiction, real Mars exploration and science fiction,
mm-hmm.
which is, when I saw your book there, I was like, this is probably something I'm going to like, and I did. So
cool.
It was.
Appreciate that, man. That's awesome. Getting back to fantasy then, which is what obviously you dive into more. What is the difference? Again, I think that anybody listening to this that maybe is interested in science fiction and fantasy, sometimes the two get lumped together. So what to you then, as far as fantasy, is fantasy and it's not science fiction?
Well, science fiction usually has to do with, obviously, technology
mm-hmm.
and science, and usually it doesn't have to be. I mean, but in our world, or at least based on our world, even Star Wars, which is somewhere else, is
mm-hmm.
Kind of based on humans and all that. Mm-hmm. So, but there are some authors who mix science fiction and fantasy. There's some sword and sorcery out there where they have fantasy elements like creatures and magic, but then all of a sudden you got technology and mixed in too. Yeah, I remember growing up watching He-Man, which was both. Yeah,
He-Man.
So
that's right. It was. I mean,
yeah,
bringing back the good old days of the Saturday morning cartoons. Yeah.
I know.
He-Man and the Thundercats maybe too in a way, but they weren't really humans. I guess they were kind of a little bit different there. But I think that whole '80s era was a little bit. It didn't know if it wanted to be fantasy or if it wanted to be science fiction. It was a little bit of a confusing time, I think, for artists.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was coming out of the sword and sorcery Conan age and moving into Star Wars and everything, and it was kind of a mix.
Yeah, most definitely. I do feel like the Lord of the Rings films had a huge impact on the fantasy genre. I mean, when they came out, it was just like boom, like everybody now was interested in fantasy. Because even before that, movies weren't even thought of like any fantasy film you wouldn't think would be up for Best Picture. It was just kind of, thrown to the wayside or something. So
yeah.
You and I have talked about this before as far as the fantasy genre is concerned. Do you think it's gained popularity even more so since then, or is it kind of died down a little bit in favor of, say, other genres perhaps, or no?
I think it's pretty strong. It did start with those movies and some other movies at the time, whether Harry Potter or the Narnia films, that really opened fantasy up to, I think, a wider audience. It always was kind of a out on the edges of popular books, and then it became mainstream, and those films really helped it push it there. Now you walk into a bookstore, and there's just tons of fantasy shelves. Plus, tons of like sub genres, paranormal fantasy, or
Yeah.
this type of fantasy, or this kind, and it's just really taken off and hasn't slowed down.
Mm-hmm.
And you can even the popularity of superhero movies, kind of a lot of them have fantasy elements to it. So it's
Yeah.
I really don't see it slowing down in publishing or film. It's still bigger in publishing, because I think just films, it's hard to find good ones to translate, and even harder to make them good. Probably half of them don't succeed, but
True.
but it's big, and for a fantasy author or even a sci-fi author, you look out there and it's kind of intimidating at times, because there's a lot of competition. But there's also a lot of people reading or watching. So this hasn't slowed down. It doesn't seem to be, which is good. Now, a writer, I don't think, should write for a market. They should just write, their story, and write what they want, regardless of what's popular. But if you're a fantasy writer, it's a good time.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I mean, you yourself have your own website, so you have your own website, DarrickDean.com. I'll give you a little plug there, Darrick.
Thanks.
And I noticed that on your website you do say specifically, you kind of have the tagline of "Find your purpose, find your story," which I think is very clever. So, what's the inspiration behind that, as far as find your purpose, find your story? Because you were kind of alluding to one of my questions, which was, there's a lot of people out there reading. There's the fantasy genre is kind of blowing up a bit. It hasn't showed any signs of slowing down. So in terms of you having your own web page and your own product and things like that, how do you separate yourself from all those other voices who are trying to earn up the space of readers, who want to read fantasy? And your tagline, I think, is a pretty good segue into that. Find your purpose, find your story. So,
Right.
if you wanted to talk to that a little bit.
One of the main themes of my fiction and what I post on my website is about people, finding what they're meant to do, finding, what they're gifted to do, what they should be doing, and never stopping until they find that, and never stop trying to achieve that. You don't want to wake up one day when you're 85 and realize, you didn't do what you were supposed to do, or you just let it go and didn't pursue it. And I think that's really a kind of a fundamental thing that everyone faces. It's just a part of everybody's experience. Finding what you're finding your story. Which I didn't come up with that, but you hear authors like Tolkien or Lewis talk about it, and a lot of other authors, but a lot of, I think every book, every author has some kind of theme or something they put in there, either on purpose or just naturally out of their own story or beliefs. But and I just think it's a really important one that really connects with people, and since it's something everyone kind of struggles with or faces in some way. It's just something that I've really think's important, and hopefully comes out in the book to some extent, and hopefully maybe hopefully people enjoy the book just for multiple reasons. It's entertaining and this and that, but also occasionally it maybe makes you stop and think, and hey, maybe look at their own life, or you can go in deep or not as deep into a book as you want. Everyone's different, but
I mean, to that exact point, I mean, just you hope it inspires somebody, but you hope it opens something for somebody somewhere, that they'll be able to connect with it in a way that they go, well, this kind of sounds like my story in a way, or perhaps my story is getting close to being a lot like this story. I think it's really interesting, since a lot of our stories are mere reflections of ourselves, our values things we want other people to know about and to really make them think. I mean, I'm a thinker's reader. I like being challenged in my thinking whenever I'm reading. I mean, that's just me personally, which is why I think I gravitate towards science fiction and fantasy, because there's that sort of limitless imagination that you're able to play with when it comes to fantasy and it comes to science fiction. So, and speaking of that, as far as fantasy is concerned, now your book, which I have here, Darrick, Among the Shadows. All right, here it is. I'm letting everyone see it who's got video. Now, Among the Shadows. Now, you mentioned this really early on, and I'm glad you did. Is a book that is as much historical fiction as it is fantasy, which I think is really cool. I think it's neat that you've tried to incorporate this book as being sort of like there's history that's happened, and then these characters have happened alongside it. So I don't want to get too far into that without you talking about your own book. Okay, I want you to be able to talk about your own stuff. So what is Among the Shadows? What is the story in a nutshell, if you wanted to just explain?
Well, I've tried to. My intent was to blur history and fantasy. We have all these myths and legends in our history, and as historians know, there's always little tidbits out of them that turn out to be true, like the classic story, the Odyssey, and Ulysses, which everyone thought was fiction, but then they found out, Troy and the war there was true. All of these history or these myths often have little bits of history lost in them, hidden in them. So I use that as a backdrop, and find not only things in legend and myth, but also some points in history, points in places that are real that no one doubts, and make that the backdrop, the landscape, so that really you start to wonder, what parts are real. It brings you into the fantasy more, because a lot of time fantasy is full of strange creatures and all these things,
Dwarves and elves and dwarves, and the like and things like that. Absolutely.
And there are a lot of interesting beings in this book, but then you're sitting there, you're wondering, okay, it don't seem quite as unreal, so you get pulled into it, and I call it historical fantasy. And hopefully it works in that way, and it pulls you in more. And story itself, it's these characters these people in our time, really. It's not in Middle Earth or wherever. It's here. It's in our history, in our time, and these are people who have found that they have gifts and connections, to the world, to the unseen, and they're among us, and they're kind of tasked or posed with protecting the world and fighting evil, and but they have to make that choice to do that. They don't have to, and they're and if they do make that choice, there's a lot of sacrifice and risk involved. And so I've tried to bring a kind of the modern world into fantasy, and I don't think I'm the first to do that. There's a lot, but not a lot of people put as much real history in it, and trying to.
I assume it takes a lot of research to do something like that. I mean, it takes a lot of time to kind of go, well, if I want my story to take place in X time, then I need to be darn well sure that I know this happened in this particular time in history, and then this followed. I can't be jumping all over the place, or else it loses its sense of realism, even though it is a fantasy. Because, quite honestly, as a reader, you've already taken the jump if you're reading it and saying, I accept that this is fantasy, but I want to still be able to relate to this somehow. I still want to be able to go, this is interesting to me, and wow, look at how he's weaved all these different things together. So I understand that your characters in this story are basically fighting sort of an unseen evil that is going on behind the scenes, and that's kind of like how you've been able to weave the story, and the reason why I know it's called Among the Shadows, Watchers of the Light, which is neat. And I, I think you and I talked about this before, that I as a reader appreciate that when somebody's able to incorporate things that have actually happened and put them into their own fantasy story in a way, as opposed to, like you said, I'm just going to go to Middle Earth now, and just everything there is new and different, and
Yeah.
I'll throw in a few orcs and trolls and all that kind of good stuff. But anyway, I guess I digress as far as my own likes or dislikes about that part of the fantasy genre. So.
Yeah, and those kind of fantasy books, they can be very detailed and really you can get lost in them. Lord of the Rings does read almost like history, the kind of detail that was put into it, and the world building and all that, and a lot of good fantasies like that. But
do you feel any kind of pressure then to be as deep and as broad as someone like Tolkien or someone like C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia? Do you feel any kind of pressure there at all, that you have to be able to mirror that, or is it more of a, well, I don't want to do anything that's unnecessary, I just want to stick to the, what I know how to do, or maybe I don't want to be that deep?
yeah, I think every author has a different style or detail level they want to tell their story, and for mine, I don't think I have to, or nor did I go to, say, the level of Lord of the Rings or some of those other books, or if anyone's ever read Robert Jordan and
oh my gosh,
the never-ending series.
Oh gosh.
Yeah,
go ahead. I didn't.
I think sometimes as an author you have to know when to stop and those are all great books, but
you're still going, when is this going to end? When is this going to be over with? Oh, the Wheel of Time continues, I guess. I don't know. So, we'll be back for book 29 or whatever it is at this point.
Yeah, it was a long series, but I try to put enough detail where it grabs you and pulls you in, but not overwhelm you. It's hard finding that balance. You don't want too little or too much. Too much, it can be, a lot of those long series are good, but sometimes it's just hard to get through them. I think you have to trust your reader a little bit and know that they're going to envision your story a little bit different among each reader. You have to accept that, and the more they're able to do that and get drawn in, the more they're going to like your story, the more they're going to turn the page and really get immersed in it. And sometimes that can be hard if you try to put too much in your story. You have to draw the line somewhere.
Right. How do you balance your time then, as far as being able to sit and either read, or do I sit and write, or just like, how do you balance that? Because I know everyone's different as far as being a creative person, and I always struggle with, should I read now or should I write? It's kind of it can be hard sometimes to figure that out. So how do you navigate that?
That is a struggle, because I read a lot, and I always have maybe 2 or 3 books in some stage of reading, and depending on what mood I'm in, I'll grab this book or that book. And sometimes it's hard to sit down and do the writing, and among everything else you got to do. So for me, I really have to schedule time. If I don't, the writing doesn't happen. If I do schedule the time, the writing comes pretty easily, and I can get a lot done. So if I don't put it there on the calendar, and this time I'm going to do this, and it doesn't happen.
Right.
And there's always seem to be, and I'm sitting in my library here, but there's always seem to be more books I need to read. I also need to be writing. It's not easy to do. You just have to commit to, like everything else. You you set time for work, your family, this and that, and you have to do that with the book too, or it doesn't get done. And this first one, it was off and on over a number of years, which some of it by design, some of it not. But I didn't want to rush the first one either. And all the time I took to do that and work on improving and the whole process, it's making the second one easier. When I actually am sitting down doing it, it's a lot easier this time.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing like just completing it. I mean, the feeling of just completing your work is it's something you just can't quite put into words, which is ironic. Being a writer, you can't quite put it into words what it's like to finish a book when you finally do finish it. But I know that feeling of just, I finished the last page. I know I'm going to have to do a little bit of editing, but man, the story's done. I don't have to, throw out half of it and start all over or something. I mean, it's just such a great feeling, and it takes so much pressure off. It's just not this looming sense of I'm never going to finish this thing. You mentioned it took you kind of off and on a few years to finish the first book for this Among the Shadows series, which, by the way, Darrick is writing a series here of the Among the Shadows. So I've seen that on your website, so I wanted to plug you there real quick, my friend. But yeah, the writing the first one, and like for me, for instance, for my Road to Mars book, I'm writing my second one right now. It is so much easier now to just kind of sit down. I have all the framework in place, and I have all the things that I needed to set up, all the rules I need to put into place before writing my second one, which now makes it a little bit easier. I don't have to kind of sit and think and, oh man, what am I going to do with this situation or this setting? What am I going to do? Speaking of which, about rules, when it comes to the fantasy world, there still need to be rules in place, right? I mean, as far as what a character can do, what they can't do, does this person defy gravity? Does that person not defy gravity? Things like that. There's still rules that have to be in place for fantasy. Yes, no, of course.
Yeah, you have to be consistent. And really in fantasy or fiction, you can make whatever rules you want and do whatever you want. Now, I think it's always better to root that in reality, which to make it seem more real. But even from that, the author always kind of reserves that right to do what they want, but they still should try to be consistent. In each character, and that's harder. It can be hard to do because each character, like in Among the Shadows, has different abilities, and you want to keep that consistent throughout the book. In each situation, and remember, what they're supposed to be doing or can do, and it can be challenging to keep everything straight, and then the context of your bigger world of what these people can do, and in their case, the enemies they face. Everything got to have some kind of consistency, even if it's fantastic, even if it's just completely out there. It's still got to be consistent scene to scene. And in here there's a little bit of where they travel to other times in history, and you got to at least make that sound and seem like it's plausible. Even though it's no one travels through time, but you got to make it at least feel like it's real and sounds like it's real. And you even try to root it a little bit in science without sounding, like you're writing a textbook, and
So. Well, I don't know if you saw the most recent movie, I guess it wasn't that recent, Doctor Strange in the Marvel series.
Yeah.
I mean, that movie right there just defies all laws of physics,
right,
and time travel and everything else. And I mean, it just it blows everything out the window as far as, time passes in a linear sense. No, it doesn't, according to Doctor Strange. So yeah, I mean, setting rules are absolutely a must, regardless if you're a fantasy writer, science fiction, whatever it may be. And it's tough to do. I mean, I try to keep an outline in Microsoft Excel. I don't know how you how you go about. I mean, how do you actually, as far as keeping your characters together? Do you write it out somewhere? Do you have like a notepad, notebook? How do you kind of keep things in order?
Well, I do have a notebook where I keep the characters and you know brief character sketches, and I outline the whole story. I almost use more of a storyboard method, like a movie. I know I have this beginning, this ending, and a couple other scenes or set pieces, and then the writing is about connecting them and letting the story
Mm-hmm.
evolve on its own to some extent. I mean, I have a roadmap there, but it's all outlined like a map. Enough detail to know where I'm going
Mm-hmm.
and what the characters are going to do, but not so much where some unexpected things can come out of the writing process. And one of the great things about writing this, and I think all authors experience this, is you're writing something, then all of a sudden there's a character or a scene that you didn't plan, and basically they kind of show up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really your story's really coming to life at that point. And I remember this. I don't remember the exact quote, but C.S. Lewis said he started his Narnia with just a picture of a lamp in the woods and maybe a fawn or something, and then Aslan pulled everything in behind him. The story, and that's what he's talking about. The story.
Mm-hmm.
He started with a couple images, a couple things, and then it just kind of almost came to life on its own. And when that happens, that's one of the best parts of writing.
Mm-hmm.
You're not just your ideas, but it's just almost like a living thing, and it's pretty neat when that happens.
Yeah, that is great. Like, I wish I had more of those moments every now and again.
Yeah.
Sometimes just like, man, I could really use some divine inspiration right now just to kind of get me in this next chapter, because I am just struggling to come up with something like a real zinger or whatever. So, but anyway, yeah. All that being said, then, sir, I wanted to give a quick plug for you and me, as we are going to be having a book signing on October 7th. We're going to be out at Leanna's Books and More up in Hermitage, PA at Shenango Valley Mall. Darrick and I will be, I guess we'll just tout ourselves as two of the front-running authors there.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah.
That'll be in attendance from 12 to 3 p.m. on that Saturday. So for those of you guys listening to this, it might be in the area, come and check it out. Darrick and I will both be there signing books. And anything else, I guess, before we kind of wrap things up here? Was there anything else as far as what you got going on, or anything that you wanted to cover as far as being a writer, being a self-published author, or just as far as I see you pretty active as far as on the blogging scene, and just kind of sharing a lot of interesting tidbits and writing information. So I always appreciate it whenever you're posting, so I can get a little bit of inspiration myself. So you're definitely someone I key into quite a bit when I'm in social media. But yeah, anything else, my man? Or
Well, that's something that writers learn real quick, and whether they like it or not, they got to get into networking and marketing, and one of the best things you can do is getting to know other writers and authors. Especially those that are writing similar things. Not so much that you hope they buy your book, but you learn from each other, both in the writing process, marketing process, the publishing process, every part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the social media, the internet, the website platform, Facebook, a lot of that is trying to reach your readers. But I've found that best part of it is, or reaching your readers and getting to know them is great, and that's one of the best. The other best part is working with other authors and working with them and learning and improving your craft. And if you're a writer, at some point you got to make that decision that you're always willing to get better, who want to get better. And even if you look at any famous author, whether it's Stephen King or Tom Clancy, or you look at their first book and then their last book, the writing's different. It's gotten better, and and that's something as a writer you got to do and commit to, and other writers, working with them is a big part of that. It's hard doing it by yourself, and in my writing I'm usually secretive and alone, but this next one is a little more open and learning them lessons that I learned on the first one. So
good. That's excellent, man. Yeah, I mean, community is such a big thing, and I'm glad you kind of summarized it that way, because you do need to get into some kind of community of writers or authors or just anyone you can bounce ideas off of, or just bounce similar concepts, or am I reading this right? And even getting you turned on to other books that you haven't read yet that they can recommend that might give you a little bit of inspiration. I mean, that happened to me in a group that I was a part of. Is that, hey, you ever read Ender's Game? And I was like, oh, I heard about that like when I was in high school. Really? I ended up reading it. It's one of my favorite books now. It absolutely is one of my favorite books. So you never know. I mean, you never know with that. So great stuff, man. I'm really glad we were able to connect here. And I look forward to checking out our book signing on the 7th. I'll look forward to seeing you there in person, so we're not actually just communicating now over the internet waves. So, but anyway, man, thanks for being on the Writer's Lens. Appreciate it. Darrick Dean, author Among the Shadows. You can check him out at darrickdean.com, and it's Darrick.
Yes.
Dean. Yes. So, and that is how you really spell it too, right? Darri.
Right. Yeah. It seems to be the rare spelling among my name, but
I think it's cool though, man. I'm like, when I first saw it, I went, man, this guy's got a pretty cool pen name, and you're like, no, that's my real name, man. I said, oh, okay, well, that's even cooler. Then I got to get to know this guy. So, all right, awesome, man. Thanks for being on the Writer's Lens. Appreciate it. I'll see you soon.
All right, thanks for having me on, and I'll be seeing you in a couple weeks here.
Absolutely.
Yep.
See you, Darrick.
All right, night.